Hi everyone, thank you for checking out our presentation, Best Legal Practices in Owning and Operating Rental Property. This particular presentation is on Airbnbs and short-term rentals. If you already haven't done so, get social with us on Facebook and Instagram for updates and articles and fun stuff on the Landlord and Tenant Board and Small Claims Court. Let's get started. Just a brief introduction. My name is Bita Delisi. My background lies in real estate. I am a real estate broker. I have been a real estate broker for the past 15 years. In real estate, that path has led me to become a property manager. I used to, and I still do, manage apartment buildings and commercial plazas for my landlord clients. And through that path, that has led me to go to the board on many occasions. And while I was going to the board, the adjudicators or the deciding members, they would not allow me to represent my landlord clients because I wasn't licensed. So I went back to school and I obtained my paralegal license, and I am happy to offer our legal services to realtors and investors and landlords. So, just a brief disclaimer, this presentation is not a basis for legal advice, nor does it establish any sort of paralegal client relationship. This basically means that anything we discuss is for information only, and in order to be a client and obtain client paralegal relationship, we do have to meet and sign a retainer, similar to that of a listing agreement or a buyer representation agreement. So many times I ask, does anybody know what the difference is between a paralegal and a lawyer? The reason I ask this question is because sometimes it is commonly perceived that paralegals are lawyers. That's not the case. We are not lawyers. However, both paralegals and lawyers are licensed by the Law Society of Ontario. We are required to carry errors and omissions insurance, similar to that of realtors. Realtors are also licensed by the Ontario Real Estate Association. They are required to carry errors and omissions insurance. They are required to also obtain and complete professional education credits and mandatory continuing professional development credits. Paralegals and lawyers are we have to abide by the rules of conduct. There are just a couple of differences between a paralegal and a lawyer. Besides the fees, paralegals practice in the lower courts, which mean they practice in the tribunals such as the Landlord and Tenant Board, the Small Claims Court, the Labor Board, whereas lawyers, they can practice in the lower courts, including the courts that I have mentioned, or the higher courts, meaning family law, criminal, higher criminal, those courts that paralegals are restricted to. Other than that, paralegals do charge more affordable fees, and they provide access to justice for those that are not able to pay the fees of a lawyer. So just a brief overview on the Residential Tenancies Act, or the RTA. This became in effect on January 31st back in 2007. The Residential Tenancies Act creates a rental housing system that protects tenants, it helps landlords, and it promotes investment in Ontario's rental housing market. So it's basically the referee. Let's call the RTA the referee. This piece of legislation affects about 1.4 million renters in Ontario. The Landlord and Tenant Board, the LTB, just a brief touch up on the LTB. The LTB resolves disputes between landlords and tenants, and either one of them can apply to the board. The LTB is actually similar to a courtroom setting. Disputes can be worked out through mediation or adjudication. So let's talk about a mediation. I always recommend mediation. And the reason for that is because in mediation, it is more likely that you have an influence on the outcome of your matter. Whereas when you go in front of the adjudicator during a hearing, the LTB member or the deciding member will listen to the matter and apply the law. So it really doesn't matter what you say or what evidence you have to propose, the law is always applied. That's why mediation is always your best bet. Now, if you can't resolve your matter in mediation, of course, then you go in front of the adjudicator and you let an impartial third party decide. Okay, so getting started on what is a short-term rental and Airbnb. This is a really hot topic nowadays as short-term rentals are becoming more and more popular because of the delays at the landlord and tenant board. So a short-term rental is defined as residential properties that are available to rent for a short period. So a short period can be defined as anywhere from 30 days to 6 months. Now, that doesn't sound like a short-term period. However, a fixed term or a long-term rental period compared to that of a long-term rental period, which is a minimum of 1 year or more, 30 days to 6 months is considered a short-term rental. An Airbnb is a short-term rental service that enables homeowners or tenants to rent out properties for side income. So short-term rentals, let's talk about that first. So short-term rentals, or STRs as we refer to them. On January 31st of last year, 2018, City Council approved the regulation of short-term rentals in Toronto. On November 18, 2019, the Local Planning Appeal Tribunal, or the LPAT, dismissed all appeals and upheld City Council's regulations and amendments to short-term rentals. Short-term rental zoning bylaws amendments are now in full force. So what does that mean for you? Let's talk about what is permitted, okay? Based on the amendments permit the following. Short-term rentals across the City of Toronto in principal residence only, so in the house that a landlord lives in, to any rental that is less than 28 consecutive days. So this is one of the things that the amendments permit. The second thing is within their principal residence, so the principal residence again being the house that the landlord lives in or the property that the landlord resides in, people can rent up to 3 rooms or the landlord can rent their entire home for a 180 nights per year. So in order for it to be considered a short-term rental, 180 nights per year out of 365 days is the cap. This makes short-term rental companies like Airbnbs, it will be required for them to maintain a license, and operators will be required to register with the city and pay a municipal accommodations tax. Of course, there's always a tax of 4%. So now let's talk a little bit about licensing and registration rules. Before this all came into effect, anyone can rent out a room via Airbnb or short-term rental company without being licensed or registered. So now that's changed. So short-term rental companies, applicants will be required to pay a one-time license application for $5,000 and a fee of $1 for every night booked through the company. Licensees will be required to ensure that all listings have valid registration numbers. They will be required to provide a process for removal of listings that do not have a valid registration number and a procedure for dealing with problematic operators and responding to complaints. They will also be required to keep records of their short-term rental activity and provide them to the city as requested. This is kind of like an audit. Short-term rental operators, this is continued from the previous slide, they will be required to pay a registration fee of $50 per year and post their city-issued registration number in all advertisements. They will also be required to pay the 4% municipal accommodations tax on all rentals less than 28 consecutive days. And of course, they must keep records of short term rental activity and provide it to the city upon request or upon an audit. Operators will need to provide the city with information including the number one, contact information and address. Number two, details of the short-term rental. So what does it include? How many bedrooms? How many washrooms? Is it furnished? Not furnished? Emergency contact person who will be available 24 hours a day during rental periods. This is very, very important. Let's talk a little bit about the pros of short-term rentals because, like everything else, there are pros and cons. So let's discuss the pros of short-term rentals. There are higher income potential, especially if they're located in an excellent location. They're usually better maintained. Having the property cleaned between rentals, the sheets are changed. It's easier to identify maintenance issues because the tenants are prospective guests, I shouldn't say tenants, are coming in and out, are moving quickly. The turnover is usually quicker. The ability to adjust the pricing. So if there's a time of year that is a slower time of the year, the pricing can be adjusted on peak seasons, summer, Christmas, holidays. These are really higher seasons. They can adjust the price to maximize their profits. Personal use. Owners can also enjoy the property especially if it's a vacation property. Self-management is getting easier. Platforms like Airbnb have made it actually easier and more affordable to advertise the property. So these are making it easier for the smaller landlords to be able to manage their property on their own. Let's discuss some of the cons of short-term rentals. They can create a disruption to the enjoyment and security of the current tenants of the residential complex. So if there are people coming in and out, this can disturb the peace for, the permanent tenants in the complex. There will be an increase to costs related to repairs and maintenance, and this is simply because there's more turnover, more wear and tear, more usage, management and security of the residential complex. Occupants are not often familiar with the rules and have no vested interest in abiding by the rules due to the length of their tenancy term. So these are for those the occupants or guests that are careless, that come to party downtown and crash at a short-term rental. Higher management expenses. If the property is overseas, often you have to hire somebody to oversee it for cleaning, to manage, to let the guests in. That could result in higher management expenses. One of the other cons of short-term rentals is that there is less consistency in payments. So unlike fixed-term or long-term rental property where the landlord receives his rent on a monthly basis, this type of rental is less consistent. The landlord must pay for utilities. That's also part of the rental agreement. And there's more effort to operate the short-term rental. Okay, so sometimes I get asked, what happens if a guest won't leave a short-term rental? What do we do? Well, the law in Ontario states that in order to evict a non-paying tenant, an N4 notice to terminate tenancy for non-payment of rent must be issued to commence the eviction process. The date that the landlord gives the guest or the tenant must be A, 14 days if the tenant or guest is renting by the month or the year, or B, 7 days if the tenant or guest is renting by the day or the week. So for short-term rentals, usually it's B. The Residential Tenancies Act does not make any direct references to Airbnbs or short-term rentals. However, in addition to the N4 notice, there are two other notices that a landlord can serve on a tenant performing these activities in a rental unit. So what do you do if your tenant is renting out your rental unit as an Airbnb? There are one of two notices. This is one of two notices that can be served on your existing tenant if they are doing Airbnb on your unit. Let's talk about the N5. The N5 is a notice to terminate tenancy for interfering with others, damages, or overcrowding. The N5 can be served if A, other tenants are complaining, B, if there's damage being caused to the rental unit, C, if your tenancy agreement does not allow the tenant to rent the unit on a short-term basis. Now, you have to keep this in mind. The N5 is a 20-day notice to end tenancy, but it allows the tenant to correct the situation or their behavior within 7 days. That's how they can void this notice. If they do not correct the situation or their behavior by the 7th day, then the landlord can file for a hearing date with the landlord and tenant board on the 8th day. If they do correct their behavior or they take down the advertisement and stop advertising the unit for short-term rental, this voids the N5 notice. The second notice is the N6, notice to terminate tenancy for illegal acts or misrepresenting income in a rent geared to income rental unit. The N6 can be served if A, the tenant is collecting more rent from the Airbnb or short-term rental than what they are paying the landlord each month for rent. This is actually considered an illegal act. The N6 is also a 20-day notice to end tenancy. However, here's the best part about the N6 in comparison to the N5. The tenant is not given an opportunity to correct the situation or the behavior. So once an N6 is served, the landlord can file with the landlord and tenant board right after the tenant is served with this notice. Now, of course, you have to have your evidence in line. You can't just serve an N6 and then go to apply for a hearing and take the tenant to the board. You have to have your evidence prepared, ready to be presented to the adjudicator at the board. What to legally take into consideration when hosting short-term rentals. Now, I'm not against short-term rentals. I just think that landlords who do short-term rentals should take certain things into consideration before doing short-term rentals. Number one, mortgage restrictions. Does your lender restrict hosting short-term rentals or sublets? This is really important because some lenders will not finance a property if they are informed that the property will be used as a short-term rental. Subsidized housing restrictions. Usually these subsidized housing restrictions or government housing, they have rules that prohibit subletting without permission. So sometimes I get calls from tenants who actually live or have a contract with Toronto Community Housing, and they end up subletting their property or their rental unit to as an Airbnb or short-term rental. That is an illegal act, and you will definitely lose your apartment in Toronto Community Housing if you are proved that you are subletting. So number 3, safety of the host and their guests. Emergency contact instructions are to be provided to guests on how the host can be contacted 24 hours a day. This is actually a requirement for the short-term rental license. Medical supplies, such as a first aid kit, this is required to be placed in the unit. Fire prevention. Smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors must be in working condition in the case of an emergency. Exits. A clearly marked fire escape route must be accessible and a map to be posted for the guests to see. This is actually for safety. So just keep in mind, you may want to show your tenants on a map in case of an emergency or fire, how they can escape the unit. Moving along, child safety. This is important. And the reason for that is because you have to consider potential hazards such as exposed wires, electrical outlet covers, lower windows to have locks and screens if somebody has a child that they're going to be bringing along with them. Climate control. Make sure the property is properly ventilated. So that means make sure the furnace and air conditioning unit are in working condition. Appliances are in working conditions as well. Occupancy limits. Overcrowding in an Airbnb or short-term rental is actually against city bylaws. So its overcrowding is not permitted. Noise. Excessive loud noises can cause neighbors to complain. So just consider that sometimes if there's drinking or partying and they decide to crash at your short-term rental, that things may get out of hand and neighbors may complain. Insurance liability. This is very important as short-term rentals must be disclosed to your insurance company. In case of any fire or water leakage from the hot water tank, in case of any damages, if it is not disclosed that you are using the property as a short-term rental, your insurance company will not cover you. Pets. Keep in mind damages can be made in your short-term rental if a guest is bringing along their pet. Smoking. This is a big one. If cigarette butts are not discarded properly, they can cause a fire. This is like a domino effect in which if you do not disclose it to your insurance company that you are conducting your property as an Airbnb or short-term rental, they may not cover you for damages. So keep that in mind. How to guard your property from tenants hosting short-term rentals. Okay, it's always great to put a clause in your lease restricting the number of days that a guest can stay. However, even if it's in your lease, sometimes guests overstay their visit. You can also put a clause in your lease restricting short-term rentals and illegal subletting. This is very important as well. Again, like a clause in the Ontario Standard lease, even though subletting without the landlord's permission is an illegal act, sometimes people do that. You must provide clarity in your leases regarding subletting. This is extremely important. Be as clear as you can be in your leases, just because you want to make sure there's a mutual understanding that when that guest arrives in your short-term rental, that there is going to be a day that they're going to leave. Hopefully it's sooner than later. And the most important, qualify prospects. I can't stress this enough. If you don't qualify a prospect, you can end up with a guest from hell or a tenant from hell. Now, sometimes tenants or guests overstay their visit. What can you do when you finally evict them? You still have to recover unpaid rental arrears. You can apply to the small claims court for any amounts owing up to $35,000 plus costs. If you are awarded the outstanding arrears, the landlord still has to collect. The landlord or the host, I should say, still has to collect. The most common way to collect outstanding arrears from tenants or guests are garnishing wages, provided that the tenant or guest works. Now, for a tenant, sometimes the landlord, in order to approve the application, they will ask for a letter of employment and pay stubs to verify income. For an Airbnb guest or a short-term rental guest, it's not necessary. So as a landlord or a host, you have to keep in mind, if you're not asking for employment information, how are you going to recover unpaid arrears should that guest not leave? So that's something to keep in mind. This brings us to the end of our presentation. I'd like to thank you for taking the last 25 minutes to go through the presentation with us. I hope you've learned quite a bit. If you have any questions, we'd love to hear from you. Get social with us on social media, on Facebook and Instagram. You can check us out at www.stonegatelegalservices.ca. Our contact information is there should you need to get a hold of us. We look forward to hearing from you soon. Bye for now.